This is our second to last section of the entire module on export compliance, section 36. Here, we're going to begin by talking about OFAC export licenses and then finish up with a few slides on the overall screening process. In the final section, we will finish that discussion and wrap up the entire module. 2 more to go. Let's get underway with a discussion on OFAC export licenses. First off, pursuant to the OFAC definition, a license is an authorization to engage in a transaction that otherwise would be prohibited. Important to note in our second bullet point, OFAC licensing requirements are separate from other agencies, from BIS, DDTC, NRC, etc. And actually, depending on the situation, there may be instances where a license from more than one agency is required. Think about Cuba, where support for the Cuban people could be a license exception used under the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, but there could also be an OFAC requirement regarding the transfer of funds or the use of a letter of credit, any variety of OFAC permissions that may be required in addition to, in this instance, the use of an EAR license exception. That's just one example. There are others. There are really 2 types of OFAC licenses. We saw this terminology used before under the NRC conversation. A general license authorizes a particular type of transaction for a class of persons without the need to apply for a license. General license, authorizing a specific type of transaction for a specific class of persons without the need to apply for a license. A specific license, however, is a written document issued by OFAC to a particular person or entity authorizing a particular transaction in response to a license application. So there are general licenses, there are specific licenses. As a trade tip, somewhat analogous, where BIS uses license exceptions to export with a license approval, OFAC employs a general license. Not the same thing, but somewhat analogous. It is an authorization to export in the case of BIS under a license exception, here with OFAC under a general license. The ability to use an OFAC general or specific license will depend on the type of sanctions in place for a country or persons. Are they comprehensive or selective? Are they blocking sanctions and or sectoral sanctions? We defined all 4 of those previously. They should be well familiar by now. In order to make a license determination, the exporter must reference the OFAC document that covers a specific sanctions program. We're going to be looking at examples of those in just a bit. A general license does not require an application, whereas specific licenses do require a written application and authorization through OFAC. Which one we use is part of that second bullet point, making a license determination. We have to look at the specific OFAC document that covers a specific sanctions program. First up, as it relates to that very subject, is a Ukraine-Russia sanctions example, general and specific license requirements. We go to the OFAC webpage, we bring up Ukraine-Russia, click on it, leads us to this information. What are we looking at? Well, authorized transactions under general license. We will note that it's broken down by general and specific licenses by country. OFAC may authorize certain types or categories of activities and transactions that would otherwise be prohibited under the Ukraine-Russia related sanctions program by issuing a general license. General licenses may be published in the regulations or on OFAC's website. Moving down, additionally, certain transactions which would otherwise be prohibited pursuant to Executive Order 13685 are authorized by general license, including, so these are the scenarios under which a general license can be used. The exportation or re-exportation of certain agricultural commodities, medicine, medical supplies, and replacement parts. Non-commercial personal remittances by U.S. persons to or from the Crimea region of Ukraine. The operation of certain accounts in a U.S. financial institution for an individual ordinarily resident in the Crimea region of Ukraine. Even with these 3 bullet points, we can see it's not just about the physical export of product. It's not just that at all. We're talking about remittances. We're talking about bank accounts. in our fourth bullet point, certain transactions with respect to the receipt and transmission of telecommunications and mail, let us not limit our thoughts to the export or import activity of trade in goods or services. It's much, much more than that. And then finally, the exportation or re-exportation of certain services and software from the U.S. Right below those 4 bullet points, for a current list of all general licenses relating to the Ukraine sanctions program, go to 31 CFR Part 589, Subpart E, and also visit this link here. As it relates to specific licenses, case by case, OFAC considers applications for specific licenses to authorize transactions that are neither exempt nor covered by a general license. Requests for a specific license must be submitted to OFAC's licensing division. Can do so via the below methods, online via a link, or for those people who actually still have fax machines, to this fax number. Ukraine-Russia sanctions, general and specific license requirements. Good example there. Let's bring this subject to life even further with an industry vertical, this time using Ivory Coast, exporting mining equipment to Ivory Coast. A U.S. seller of mining equipment based in Colorado has received an order for an export to a firm in Ivory Coast. The exporter has never shipped to this destination before, but knows there may be OFAC sanctions in place. From an OFAC perspective, what should the exporter do? We're talking about from an OFAC perspective here. If the exporter wishes to proceed, because there's no rule that says they have to try and fill an order, the steps are as follows. As we saw, under Sanctions Programs on the OFAC website, download and analyze the PDF document that details Ivory Coast. Number 2, in that document, the reader notes that per the annex to Executive Order 13396, the property and interest of certain entities and individuals in Ivory Coast have been blocked. The exporter can then run the name of the person or persons and or firm in Ivory Coast on the specially designated nationals list, reverting back to that all-important list we've discussed a few times now. Per the sanctions, it is prohibited for U.S. companies to do business with any person on that list. However, for persons not on the list, a general license application may be authorized. As a quick reminder, because we've seen this website a couple of times now, this is the OFAC sanctions programs and country information. We made this a little bit smaller so we could actually see Ivory Coast down at the very bottom of this slide. Previously, we only saw the Bs, Balkans, Belarus, etc. We made it a little bit smaller so we could actually see the Ivory Coast link. We click on that, and what do we get? Continuing on our industry vertical, exporting mining equipment to Ivory Coast. This is what we will find when we click on that link to Ivory Coast from the OFAC webpage. A little bit different than what we saw previously for the Ukraine-Russia example. Prohibited transactions. Current Ivory Coast sanctions block the property and interests in property of persons listed in the annex to Executive Order 13396, as well as specific individuals, actual people, and entities determined by the Secretary of the Treasury after consultation with the Secretary of State. If these individuals or entities have engaged in these activities, it's a prohibited transaction to constitute a threat to the peace and reconciliation process in Ivory Coast, such as by blocking the implementation of a given treaty, an agreement from January of 2003, a couple of other agreements, standing in the way of the peace process, individuals and or entities. To be responsible for serious violations of international law in Ivory Coast. To have directly or indirectly supplied, sold, or transferred to Ivory Coast arms or any related material or assistance, advice, or training related to military activities. To have publicly incited violence and hatred contributing to the conflict in Ivory Coast. To have materially assisted, sponsored, or provided financial, material, or technical support for any activities described above, to be owned or controlled by or acting or purporting to act for or on behalf of, directly or indirectly, any person listed in or designated pursuant to Executive Order 13396. In essence, transactions are prohibited with any individual or entity that has engaged in any of these 5 bullet point activities. Down the bottom, the names and persons and entities listed in the annex to Executive Order 13396 or designated pursuant to Executive Order 13396 or the regulations whose property and interests in property are therefore blocked are published in the Federal Register. That's probably the 5th or 6th time that we've said that. We'd have to look or vet our process in part by using the Federal Register. There are other tools, many of which we've alluded to, that we'll get into greater detail in just a little bit. But another good industry vertical, this time about exporting mining equipment to Ivory Coast. If we have any thoughts of exporting mining equipment to this company, and any of the officers of that company or people involved in any way with that company have engaged in any activities listed here, it's a prohibited transaction. If we find that we need an OFAC license, a specific OFAC license, this is the landing page on the OFAC website for an online application. We won't read through the whole thing, but just another resource. The following information is intended to serve as guidance to persons applying for licenses authorizing exports of agricultural commodities, medicine, and medical devices to Iran and Sudan pursuant to the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. Some additional steps necessary in order to submit the application: review and accept the terms of the agreement, provide general information, add information on exporters, products, financial institutions, etc. Within each step, detailed instructions are provided. Basically, the opening page for the submission of a new license application pursuant to the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000. More details on that application. We can see the product category here is medicine. Would have to list a request date, country program, Sudan, export value, a series of data points that must be filled in. Additional information, nothing major here. Business names, phone numbers, address, contact names, etc. Nothing out of the ordinary here. Just some thorough information for the OFAC license application. We're going to stop here. When we come back for the 37th and final section of Module 3, we'll be talking about something that we've mentioned on a number of occasions: the screening of export transactions. Not just restricted party screening when an export is ready to move, but a culture based on the vetting and screening of customers and potential customers around the world in a pre-sale, sale, and even post-sale environment. Screening is a transaction-wide process. That's the theme that we'll be covering in this next section.